Welcome, everyone. And to say that, again, we are so delighted to have so many of you on our Get Connected. For those of you who are not familiar with Get Connected is Boston's premier inclusive networking event that brings together people of all cultural backgrounds to break barriers down, to make connections, to come together and really create an inclusive, equitable, and diverse network for all of us, for those of us who want to get to know people across culturally diverse lines. Get Connected is the place for you. And we have been setting the bar by introducing what I like to call Boston's hidden figures. And these are people who are not necessarily known to the full Boston. And so we have been doing these lists of the 100 most influential people of color. We have done the 100 people, 50 people of color in life science and healthcare, the 50 most influential attorney, the 25 most influential millennials in Boston. And the whole idea of that is to demonstrate that people of color are making contributions to the economic, social, and political fabric of our city and our Commonwealth. We also highlight and honor both women, white women and white men who are diversity, equity, and inclusion allies, people who advocate and who help to change the inequity that exists in our society. So we are, again, very honored and delighted to have on today our Congressman Joe Kennedy as kicking off our May thought leader and mentor and masterclass series. So I am wondering, I want to first of all to thank my team of band of brothers and sisters, led ably by Mirav Avshai, Ariel Lee, who is amazing in her design and work, and of course our producer, not Lars Anderson, but Lars Eric Seren, who is working behind the scenes to make me look good. And all of our interns, Yuki, and also I am Fernanda, sorry. And they are also working very hard for all of this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Let me just give you all a little background. I have known Joe Kennedy, who is my congressman, because I live in Brookline. And I knew Joe when he was a little kid, redheaded kid, living in Brooklyn, Brighton. And because his dad was very involved, I knew his uncle, Ted Kennedy, and have always had a great admiration for the Kennedy family because of their civic engagement, their commitment to equity and inclusion, and to being on the civil rights issues. And so when Joe was first running for the Congress, I got a call from him to tell me that he was going to run, and he was hoping that I would be on his team. And of course, I was just delighted and honored and thrilled that he was going to make public service, which was not surprising, a part of his future. He has started his life after college, law school, spending time in the Peace Corps and going to the Dominican Republic, which is the home of my grandfather, and worked there, actually learned Spanish and learned to interact with the people there, which is so like Joe. To know Joe really is to love him. He has worked in the district attorney and from there decided to run for the Congress. And what I like about Joe Kennedy is that he is not afraid to take on those issues that are the issues of inequity, health care, the issue of housing, education, climate change, and the Green New Deal, the sustainability. And most recently, Joe has partnered with Reverend Barber, who, if you know him, he is a giant of a man in every sense of the word, and an advocate and a drum major for inclusion, for equity, for all that is good, social justice. And I am so delighted that Joe has decided to run for the Senate, because now more than ever at this time in our lives, we need people like Joe Kennedy in our Congress, both in the House and in the Senate. And I wanted to have Joe on our on this first kickoff of our thought leaders, because I think often people think when you're a professional, somehow, you know, your life, your civic life just goes to the side. And my sense is your civic life is extremely important to this year more than ever. Every single person, and in particular, people of color, need to be engaged, they need to be involved, and they really need to be sure that we go to the polls. So on that note, I am going to ask Joe to my first question. Joe, welcome. Before I even ask you any questions, is there anything you'd like to say?
Can you guys hear me, first off?
Yes, we can hear you. We just can't see you.
So first off, Colette, thank you for I was here when you said all those kind words about me, so thank you for that. Truly grateful for it. Grateful for your mentorship, your engagement, your friendship, your advice, your counsel, all the way through from my very first days in my very first race up through today. And I think for everybody and all of the participants on this forum, you know, as I do, that there are a few people across Boston and Massachusetts that have the breadth of relationships and the scope of the relationships that Colette has. She is an incredible and extraordinary connector, but uses those connections for good, and uses those connections to try to advance the interests of people and causes that she cares about. And I'm really grateful, Colette, to be able to engage with everybody here once again, and to get some feedback and some thoughts and some suggestions as we go forward. And again, apologies for the delay here, but my hope in this would be to kick this open to a conversation pretty quickly and answer as many questions as we possibly can. I'll give you a little bit of an update of kind of where things stand from my perspective with regards to Washington and a campaign, and then we can go from there. With regards to DC, look, this is obviously, as it is everywhere else, an extraordinarily challenging and unprecedented time. Congress has never gone through facing a threat like this, literally in our history. And And so I think there's some things here that Congress has, ways in which Congress has responded well, and there's some ways in which we've fallen pretty far short. So with regards to kind of the upside here, at least initially, you've got a Congress that is extremely divided in a country that is extremely polarized. And we have seen over the course of the past several weeks, Congress has come together to appropriate nearly $3 trillion of necessary relief to families across the country in a way that would have been unheard of back in early February. And to some extent there, I think that does deserve some recognition. I think as we start to dive into some of the ways in which that funding has been doled out, the design of some of those programs, it obviously leaves people wanting. With regards to probably the most talked about program there so far, the Paycheck Protection Program, while we've doled out nearly $700 billion, but just shy of $700 billion through that program, it's still not enough money for small businesses. Some of the smaller businesses, the businesses for which this program was designed, still have yet to get those funds. Not just far too much money has gone to larger companies, some even public companies paying their executives millions of dollars, and even some that have recently filed agreements with the Department of Justice for in exchange for non-prosecution agreements, which is exactly not what the funding was supposed to be used for. We've seen businesses, particularly within urban centers, oftentimes get left out. And I think a growing consensus there that one area that needs additional support is financial institutions like CDFIs going forward. We've seen the design of some of those projects there leave other people out. The idea that an arrest record could, in the past 5 years, could disqualify somebody from a paycheck protection assistance is obviously just an arrest in and of itself, without an adjudication of an underlying offense, is extremely prejudicial and has a disproportionate impact across various parts of our society. We've seen the response with regards to our health sector, I think, still be woefully inadequate, particularly when it comes to almost every phase of this. From the initial challenges around adequate testing, which still lingered to this day, to challenges still with regards to acquisition of sufficient personal protective equipment. The first several weeks of this crisis, guys, I spent hours a day trying to chase down masks and gloves and gowns from like every corner of the world that I could find, which is just stunning that's what you have here in the United States. And I think there's a big reckoning that will force to the fore when it comes to how we pull ourselves out of this. We didn't authorize nearly enough money for individuals. And the initial suggestion from Republicans was about $1,000 for individuals. That was bumped up to $1,200. I was calling for $4,000 for folks that are making under $100,000 a year. So a family of four, if you and your spouse each are making under $100,000, you get $12,000. And the idea for that was to make sure that if the goal on this was to try to make sure that people could focus on their health, take care of their families, not have to feel the pressure to go out and work, then $1,200 wasn't going to be enough to get people through a month in Boston, in Greater Boston, and in many of our urban centers around the country. You'd need far greater economic assistance to make sure people could pay their mortgage, their rent, pay for the groceries for potentially a couple of months at a time in order to finally get our healthcare sector up to a place where it could take on this virus. And we're getting there, but we're still not there yet. I think the response going forward, we should be learning more about some of the priorities of this next package in the next day or so from our leadership, but certainly more assistance to small businesses, certainly more assistance to individuals and families. A big premium here, and I spoke to Chairman Richie Neal about it this morning, about the need for state and municipal aid. State budgets are going to be devastated by this. Early projections indicate that Massachusetts will have a shortfall of about 10%, roughly $4 or $5 billion. But that's between now and June 30th. And for next year, somewhere in the order of 25 to 30%. And keep in mind, a state like Massachusetts spends 40% of our state budget on healthcare. And you don't really want to cut healthcare in the midst of a pandemic. So if you got a 30% budget shortfall, the biggest line in there is something that you can't really cut in the midst of a pandemic. It means the additional response, unless the federal government steps up on education, on transportation, on everything from programs to at-risk youth to the contracts with first responders. All of that gets put in severe jeopardy. So that's going to be a big piece going forward. I've been doing some work of late trying to push and start to shape the narrative as to what needs to happen to make sure that we don't go through this again. And some of the larger conversation, as Colette referenced, with folks like William Barber, and you'll see a little broadcast tonight off our Facebook page with Pramila Jayapal about some of the initiatives that we're working on and ideas to try to make our healthcare system far more equitable, to make our economy fairer and stronger, and to try to start to really pay those essential workers the respect and honor that they deserve. And so that's been a big area of focus and will continue to be going forward. Last piece, I'll just touch on the campaign. It is extremely hard to run a campaign when you can't campaign. Colette knows that my efforts from the beginning of this race and every race was to basically hit the pavement hard, more high fives, more handshakes, more fist bumps, just canvass the state, hopefully build up a bit of momentum, raise the money that you need to then go carry that message to every corner of the Commonwealth and just kind of, run hard, but run your way right through to an election. We can't do that. You can't get those high fives and handshakes, obviously. The challenges that all campaigns are confronting around fundraising are pretty well known at this point. And people, for very understanding and deserving purposes, don't really want to hear all that much about politics. So trying to get into this at this moment is a bit harder. It affects every campaign. It's going to impact us a bit differently. Every campaign a bit differently, but it impacts all of us. And so I think every campaign is trying to find its way forward. I will say that if I thought that there was a need for stronger leadership in the United States Senate 8 months ago, I feel even more so, more strongly about that now. The issues that we're going to have to confront, the challenges that are before us as to how we rebuild out of this are big and hard and deep and long. And I think it's going to take that, energetic and consistent and tenacious leadership to fight our way through it. And that's what I want to bring. So happy to talk about campaign, happy to talk about policy, happy to go into whatever you want here, Colette. But again, apologies for the video, but really grateful for the opportunity. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And you touched on a couple of things that I wanted to kind of expand on a little, and that is certainly the monies that were first released was certainly not enough, particularly for Black and Latinx-owned businesses that have been particularly vulnerable. And because their owners, again, are not wealthy, and a lot of the employees of Black and Latinx business are people of color. And so while there have been a lot of foundations and local government and both state, city, federal have brought resources together, it is still not enough. And one of my big concerns is that we are in danger of losing a whole generation of Black and brown entrepreneurs and businesses because of this pandemic. And I would love to hear your thoughts around what we can do really to ensure that these businesses do not go off the table completely, and that we have wiped out a whole generation of entrepreneurs and businesses.
So Colette, I think it's a great question. I think it's the right question. And I would say I've got some thoughts to that, but I'm also happy to open that up for, I have no doubt that some of your attendees will have some thoughts to that too, which would be, I think, very valuable for me to hear. So a couple of things. One, you're right. And I don't think Congress has done enough. I think there's a emerging, if not already a consensus, at least amongst my fellow Democrats, that is the case, and that more needs to be done, and it needs to be done right away. I mentioned CDFIs, right? So I think one of the issues that we have here is not just money directly out, but how can money be lent out to or given to financial institutions that can then leverage that money to get a bigger bang for that buck and get that money out into communities, because there is so much need. And I think CDFIs can be really helpful and valuable in helping to, in the community development part of their mission, really helpful to try to get some of that money out into underserved communities. I know that the PPP program, you know, we've had on the one hand a lot of money's been doled out that way, right? Which is great. We've been doing a number of meetings with kind of Zooms with chambers of commerce and local commercial entities and whatnot, and normally in conjunction with the SBA. One of the SBA folks from Massachusetts, I think it was late last week when I was on doing a session with him. There's 11 people in that office at SBA Colette. They had done in the month of April 47,000 loans, or 47,000 applications by 11 folks, right? And the partners, right? So the from the local banks down up through SBA, 47,000, which is more than they had done in the entire 10 years combined in a month. Wow. Which on the one hand, folks deserve, you know, some credit for being able to move that volume. On the other hand, that's also going to be part of the problem, right? Is you have this amount of money and then you say, hey, you got to get it out with systems that aren't designed to get it out. And then you're going to have folks that, you know, where there are more streamlined processes to get that money out, that money's going to flow out faster. And so who gets left holding the bag? Well, the mom and pop corner store that it has, you know, doesn't have a lawyer, doesn't have a lobbyist, doesn't have an accountant, doesn't know how to make all of this work. And all of a sudden is left trying to navigate through this with a bank that you don't have much of a relationship with some loan officer there or program officer there that is massively overburdened, and trying to process these claims through as quickly as they can. And there's mistakes, right? And we've gotten a fair amount of incoming from small business owners that applied for some quantity of funds and there was a mistake and they didn't get them, and you know, now they're upset. And so we have to acknowledge that and move forward and move through it. I think also, you know, one area of focus that has gotten, or two areas that I think need additional attention and we've been working on. One is an emerging field here, which is marijuana. Obviously, having it still being facing a federal prohibition means that an awful lot of, means that these federal programs largely exclude a marijuana industry from additional, from any sort of that assistance. And for some of those position shops, as you alluded to, that would be backed by either larger entities or have greater access to financing, they can make it through this period. For some of the other ones, they can't. And for those folks that might be somewhere along the line of applying for or trying to get through this process, having this delay is going to be particularly challenging. The other, as I pointed out, you know, if you're going through a PPP program and you're going to have to justify some interaction with our criminal justice system, even if it happens just to be an arrest or a pretrial disposition, right? You know, I was a prosecutor for a couple of years. You know, our mistakes get made, right? Cases get dismissed, and you know, and a lot of reasons, pretrial probation sometimes is the right adjudication to a case. The idea that all of a sudden is going to be something that creates a red flag for further investigation, that's not the easiest thing for a federal loan officer to go dive into the state court records. And I understand the details behind how a case was adjudicated 4 years ago, right? Like that's, the barriers that get put up there are substantial. And so, you know, I think there's ways here in the design of these programs that were not as inclusive or as equitable as they should have been. But I'm very happy to take other suggestions about how, and then the last part, there was $60 billion out of this last package that was reserved for minority-owned businesses, rural businesses, businesses that essentially that were largely excluded, whether it was intentional or not, from that first $350 billion from CARES. I think, again, Congress recognizing that there was not, that some of these funds were not getting to some of those communities that were in need. So there has been some steps taken to be intentional about being more inclusive, but certainly more needs to be done.
I absolutely agree, Congressman. I was going to also ask you this specifically, whether Congress have thought about credit bureaus, because this is such an unprecedented time that I cannot imagine that at least 80% of the American people will be in some way affected in their ability to pay their bills. And if the credit bureaus are going to be recording late payments or inability to pay, everyone is going to have messed up credit ratings. So is that part of any of the Congress's thinking around how do they do a reset button and change the way credit scores get recorded so that it doesn't affect people's ability in the future to buy a home, to get a loan, which you just so saliently pointed out with the court system. So I wanted to throw that out to you as a question.
It's a great question, Colette. And so yes, the short answer is there has been a lot of push on the credit agencies. I do not believe that there's been specific wording that has been passed to do so yet. But let me say a couple of things on this. One, a number of credit cards and financial institutions are offering some form of voluntary assistance at this point, which is great, but it's voluntary, right? So some people are going to get that assistance, some people aren't, but that's not enough. You then still, even if it's voluntary, are kind of on their mercy to try to make sure that they don't report it to a credit bureau, right? And that could be anything, as everyone on this call knows, from a landlord to somebody with a car loan to credit card, whatever else, right? Which is going to lead to long-term consequences when people's credit gets dinged, even if there are various abatement programs there. Even if a credit card company says, hey, you don't have to pay, but if that credit card company is still reporting the fact that somebody didn't pay, your credit can get dinged. And so this has been an area of focus. We've signed letters to the major credit card companies telling them to put in additional support to make sure that this doesn't happen. It's also, Colette, where I think there's been some momentum around initial proposals around forbearance, right? So rather than kind of depending on the generosity of a landlord or any one note holder to say, hey, you don't have to pay this month, where you just basically say the entire chain here gets frozen and no one has to pay for a period of time. And that means that, if you only say, hey, renters don't have to pay, that's great. But if you own a triple decker in Malden or Melrose or Cambridge or Dorchester or anywhere else, if you're owner occupied and you rent out those two other floors, if those two other folks aren't paying you, well, if you need that money to pay the mortgage and you default, guess what? The bank is coming in foreclosing and kicking everybody out anyway. And by the way, the bank needs that money coming in the door because they've got their own financial issues that loans they have to service, debts they have to pay off. And so the benefit of forbearance is you essentially freeze that entire chain and say no one has to pay, and you have to do the entire chain, because if you don't do one link in it, the entire system comes crashing down. Now, the challenge with forbearance is that if you say, hey, no one has to pay a bill for 3 months, if all of a sudden you got to pay 3 months rent after not being in work, after being out of work for 3 months, no one's gonna be able to pay 3 months rent. And so what this does, unless you provide additional assistance, is you essentially just postpone a foreclosure crisis and ensuing financial calamity for a couple of months rather than prevent it. And so that's where, again, I think you got to do the forbearance piece. You can do the forbearance piece with some direct cash payments, as we talked about before, and with some additional supports to make sure that people can, in fact, focus on their health and get healthy, rather than having to worry about going to work and choosing between their financial solvency and their family's health.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up. There are probably many people on this call who may not know that you played an amazing, phenomenal role in raising money, in going out and campaigning for candidates back in 2018, which led to a switch and a flip of our House to Democrat. And I want to, first of all, thank you for that, because I know that you raised a tremendous amount of money. When we were meeting your kitchen cabinet, you were traveling all over the country to go help a lot of your colleagues who got in now. And I want to ask you, because to me, 2020 is going to be perhaps the single most important election in the history of this country because of the current administration. And one of the concerns I have is about voter suppression. And with this pandemic, I am also concerned about people of color and people in general getting to the polls. So can you talk about that and mail in? Because if we are still shut down and sheltered in place in November, how is that going to impact our ability to ensure fair elections?
So, Colette, a couple of things. First off, thank you for the shout out on the work for and the travel for other members. Look, I think a big part about being a representative at any level is that you do everything you can do to try to contribute to the challenges that we confront, right? There's areas here where there's potential for collaboration. There's areas where this is politically, it's a fight. And drafting legislation is part of that, and signing letters is part of that, sure. But, you know, when we run into issues on immigration, more letters to Stephen Miller isn't going to solve the problem. When we run into issues on healthcare, more letters to Alex Azar isn't going to solve the problem. When you run into issues on the fundamental inequities in our economy, more letters to Secretary Mnuchin and Secretary our labor secretary aren't going to solve the problem either. And so you have to do what you possibly can, all that I think we possibly can, to fight back against it. And a big part of that is campaigning for the people. It's traveling the country and it's raising money for them. And I think this time and this moment that we're in calls for that relentlessness to do everything you possibly can. And I do think that there's opportunities, particularly at that U.S. House member from Massachusetts, where you can do that. We've seen Catherine Clark's done an awful lot of that. We've done a lot of that work together that you referenced. Ayanna Pressley's done a lot of that work with us this cycle since she's been there. Chairman Neal and Chairman McGovern have done an awful lot of that part too, right? There's ways here. Congressman Seth Moulton ran around the country and raised money for other folks, national service related folks last cycle. There's opportunities in Massachusetts, obviously, to do that. And Senator Warren did an awful lot of that, obviously, in part related to perhaps a presidential campaign, but also because she can and she does, and she did. And I think that's an essential part of this role that I think we can get more out of from obviously that other Senate position. With regards to the challenges confronting our electorate, I think this year's it's a big one, and I don't think people in Massachusetts, the legislature here in Massachusetts, is taking this threat appropriately at this point. So Colette, we saw in Wisconsin about 4 weeks ago now, what happens when you choose to force an election in the midst of a global pandemic. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a city that normally has 180 polling locations, they only could find poll volunteers to work 5 of them. The consequence of that was lines that literally went on forever. And at least as of last week, 36 documented cases of a transmission of coronavirus to people that went out and stood in those lines to be able to exercise their right to vote, right? And so when you think about the consequence of what this could mean in Massachusetts and the progressive bastion that we say we are, we know that the virus can infect everybody, right? We also know that the incidence of severe illness are highly correlated with minority communities. We know that there's a disproportionate percentage of people of hospitalizations that are African-American men. We know that the infection rate of Chelsea is about 5 times higher than the state average. We know that we know that environmental justice communities that have higher rates of air pollution and water pollution and environmental degradation, that those overlap extremely well with areas of higher rates of infection, because this is a respiratory illness that it tackles weakened immune systems or weakened respiratory systems. And so we can project then what that's going to mean if there is going to be either one, a circumstance where society opens too early, or two, that at some point there's a seasonal effect on this and the virus starts to come back, whether it's in the late summer, early fall, or by November. What does that mean? Well, it means that if we only allow people to or force people to vote in person, it means that you have to be able to be well enough to go vote on election day, and potentially be willing to stay on line for a long time, which in and of itself is a huge disproportionate impact to folks that can't afford to go stay in line for a long time. But in the midst of a public health epidemic, it means that you have to be well enough to do so, or willing to risk your health to do so, which is a pretty extraordinary choice to have to put on the people of Massachusetts. It also means that if we're saying, hey, we can allow early vote, which is critical and we need to do, and is permitted at the moment for the election in November, although not the election in September. But if you're sick with this virus, you have to quarantine for a couple of weeks. So if you got 10 days of early vote, that's great. Hey, I'm planning to go vote next week. Oh, I got sick, or my wife got sick, or we've been exposed to it. I can't go outside now for another week. You're not going to vote. Guess where the areas that are more likely to be hit by that? They're communities of color. And so what happens? Those communities can't vote. So what needs to happen is a far more robust vote by mail program. 5 other states already do this. They mail everybody a ballot. We can mail everybody a ballot. It ain't that hard. There's some logistical issues around it. Those logistical issues I don't think are insurmountable. We try to say we're the smartest state in the nation. I think we can figure out how to make sure that every person registered voter in the state gets a ballot. And again, remember that about close to 60% of the registered voters in the state are not enrolled. So if we're just saying, hey, we're going to mail ballots to people that are registered either Democrat or Republican or Independent or Green Party or whatever party, if you're just doing that, you're not sending ballots to 60% of the people, roughly 60% of the registered voters. That's an extraordinary 2-tiered system that says we'll celebrate the franchise of some, but not all. And I don't think Massachusetts has to do that either. So we're pushing for, yes, a robust expansion of early vote, because that's important and that matters. And some people want to go out and vote and they want to vote in person. And there's people that will be more inclined to do so. Great. But I also think that every person needs to get mailed a ballot, because even if you want to go out and vote, I mean, Colette, there's obviously no guarantee that I don't get sick come mid-August and I can't vote. And I want to make sure that as I give up my political career here, I at least have my vote's going to be counted. And I think we should be able to make that case for every single registered voter in Massachusetts.
I absolutely agree with you. And I'm going to throw in a 2-cent worth and then open it up to questions. I think Election Day in this country should be a national holiday that allows people to go to the polls and not have to either go before work or during work or at the end of the day. If it's a day that people could go and vote all day long, to me that makes absolute sense in a country that touts its democracy.
So, Colette, I obviously would agree with you. I would just also say, even having Election Day a holiday, as you know, and as everybody on the call probably does, that solves that challenges, that alleviates barriers for some, but certainly not all, right? As I'm sure other families can attest to at the moment. I'd like to think my wife and I had a deep appreciation for teachers. After being here for 6 straight weeks with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, where our daycare facilities have been closed, that's a lot, right? All of a sudden, if it's a national holiday and schools are closed, daycare is closed, there's other challenges there. Now, all of a sudden, if you're a single mom with a couple of kids or single parent with a couple of kids, you got to figure out how to wrestle those kids while waiting online for a couple of hours at the polls. That ain't going to work either, right? So national holiday certainly helps. Making sure, look, we need to provide options to folks. A national holiday is clearly a great idea for a vast majority of people, right? Being able to be mailed a ballot so that you can do this at 10 o'clock at night after your kids are asleep, fill the thing out and put it in the mail, right? Let's make it easy. We can do that. It doesn't cost that much money. Let's make sure that you have 2+ weeks, 3 weeks of early votes, so you can pop into the town hall if it is easy for you to do so, at a time that is convenient for you to do it. Now, one of the challenges just with early vote, Colette, is not every polling location is going to have early vote. Normally that comes to a town hall. Some town halls are far easier to access than other ones. And so that's why, from my perspective, just meet people where they are and provide people options. This shouldn't be this difficult. And the idea that it is so difficult should tell you something about just how much people want you to be able to vote.
Thank you. There is, let me get to some of the questions. Daryl Settles says, thank you, Congressman Kennedy, for your engagement this morning. And he wanted to know if there is any emphasis happening right now or being planned for retraining efforts. As we know, many of the lower end service jobs will be totally restricted by demand or just eliminated, period, as businesses struggle to get expenses under control. And many of those jobs, as we all know, are held by brown and Black people, and that these are the people that will be most impacted. And he was asking, saying that we will need to have retraining, getting people into new areas, maybe of the digital economy. And he wanted to know if you could provide some thoughts on that.
Daryl is 100% right. I think he's, so great question and a great point. And the short answer to Daryl is, yes, there's some thought going into that. How we fully flesh that out at this point, probably not, although I am, and we should talk, because I am trying to give that a fair amount of thought at the moment. So a couple of things. One, we want to, obviously, some of us anyway, want to avoid some of the lessons of the last crisis in 2008, 2009, where we essentially came out of that crisis with part of our segment of our economy that was able to capture enormous economic gains over the preceding decade, and another segment of our economy that scraped by, and another that was left behind. And so we know that there was about a 3%, little over 3% unemployment rate nationally. Regionally, that gets broken up quite a bit differently, but CBO is still projecting, the Congressional Budget Office is projecting unemployment rates still above 10% by the end of 2021. So 18 months from now, still 2021. Which means that the concern, obviously, that this recovery is not the V, celebrated V or U, as they say, but pretty precipitous drop. We'll pick back up some steam, but then kind of plateau and hopefully climb out of this over the months ahead. But that's going to mean some severe pain and economic dislocation, although also some opportunities, right? The governor has set up a very ambitious contact tracing program in the state. We need to hire thousands of people to conduct that contact tracing. And the country needs to hire tens of thousands of people to do so, minimum. We need to we should be taking advantage of this moment as businesses without question, are going to start changing some of their practices, right? About, workspace and who comes to work, as particularly we had the worst commute in the country to begin with. People aren't probably going to be cramming on the T or the commuter rail anytime soon. The commutes by car can't get much worse because people just won't come to work. Well, there's probably an echelon of folks that now is going to feel more comfortable about working from home. Not everybody, but an echelon. There's some jobs that can be done by telecommuting. There's some that can't. As that changes, what does that mean for local labor markets? As we have realized the weakness for our country with regards to API, that active pharmaceutical ingredient that China makes between 80 and 90% of for every single pharmaceutical that you use, 80 to 90% of that active ingredient made in China. That's a pretty outrageous national security issue that our government has allowed to take place. And obviously when it comes to PPE, we can't afford one country, whichever country that is, to make the vast majority of the world's PPE going forward. Another pandemic is going to happen. It's a question of when, not if. We need to be able to supply our own stuff here. There was a young man that has a manufacturing company in Fall River, Darrell, who now is the largest manufacturer of medical quality gowns in the country, and 8 weeks ago didn't make a single gown, right? And they are now looking to expand floor space in Fall River, start making more of this stuff. He's reached out for help on some federal contracting issues here, which we're trying to wrestle with. But there's an enormous opportunity where, yes, we might be willing to pay a little bit more for that resiliency in a supply chain, which means, you pay essentially a little bit of insurance to ensure that if we need it again, it's going to be there for you. And there's going to be a global crush on PPE for years now, because just because we get through it here doesn't mean it's not going to go to the southern hemisphere as we get into summer and they get into winter and then come back again. So I think there's starting to be some analyses as to what jobs are going to be decimated by this, where some of those opportunities are. And then we run into those two questions. How do you retrain people? And then how do you link person to job, right? Because some of those jobs might not be where people are actually dislocated. So whether that means moving people from, we'll call it Boston to Fall River, or Fall River to Boston, or say Massachusetts to Pennsylvania, or West Pennsylvania to Massachusetts. And that's one of the challenges with our labor markets, right? Of how do we structure these incentives, not just for the retraining issue, but to the extent that part of this is going to be physical need, how do we this was an issue with Obama wrestled with. You had more coal miners than our country needed and not enough nurses, but not every coal miner wanted to be a nurse, and not every coal miner lived where we needed more nurses. So how do you make that square peg fit a round hole? But if you got ideas, it is something we're actually looking at. So I'd love to hear suggestions.
Thank you for that. There is a constituent, Michaela Houston, who said not a question, but she wants to thank you for being one of the loud voices in our Commonwealth for equity and for the people of Massachusetts. Another person says that her county needs more available and easily accessible testing kits. How can we push our leaders to make decisions that ensure more testing?
So this has been a huge focus of mine, and I do actually, I know it's been a focus of our governor. We actually had the most amount of folks tested. I think we set a record today with over 15,000 people tested either today or yesterday. It's still nowhere near enough. And I think I would tell you that, and I think our governor would tell you that. When as this crisis started to come to Massachusetts, and I was on the phone with him now, this first conversation probably about 6 weeks ago, and I asked him what he needed, he said two things: PPE and testing. And so we helped make sure that in the that big CARES package, that $2.2 trillion bill, that there was money for testing put into the $130 billion that was made available to our healthcare sector to make sure that we could start to scale up testing. We need to do it. We still need to have a long way to go, particularly when it comes to, we're looking at different types of tests. So not just that kind of what started off as the nasal swab or the even cheek swab where this started, but serology tests, antibody tests, et cetera. And we need to come up with a form here where, and a delivery mechanism where you can essentially roll this out, obviously not the same thing, but with the ubiquity of essentially a pregnancy test, right? Where you can get them easily. You can essentially do this more or less at a stay at home or almost by yourself, or if need be, some mass controlled drive-through testing center with a rapid response. Because we're going to need to make sure that as we open up, there's going to be other people that get sick. We can identify those individuals quickly. We can quarantine them. We can quarantine the people that had contact with them, and we can get in front of the flare-ups that otherwise are going to plague our recovery. And so we'll keep pushing for it. I'll certainly keep pushing for it in this next package, but I think there's in the last package that we just did, there was an additional 25 billion just for testing. So we'll keep pushing, I promise you.
There's a question from someone who says that one of the downsides of isolation and social distancing is that for people who have mental challenges and mental health issues, it can cause anxiety and other things. And how can policymakers sort of ensure that while we adhere to the severity of this pandemic, that we are also being sensitive to the needs of people who isolation can be difficult for them from a mental health perspective?
Absolutely. So this has been a big area of focus of mine for years, actually, as my time in Congress, on trying to make sure that we get the acknowledgement that our entire mental health system is a betrayal of our values when it comes to healthcare in this country. The single largest providers of mental health are jails in LA and Chicago, Cook County and LA County. There's 55% of the counties in our country do not have a single practicing psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker. This has been a major, again, I've been working on various bills, and I have, I don't know, a dozen or so that I've filed working on pieces of this, and we're in the midst of trying to file a overhaul to our mental health care system. We've actually seen some gains because of this, because of the virus, particularly with regards to telehealth. That had been a big challenge and still remains one, and some of the technicalities on this, but given the lack of availability of professionals here, being able to get access to some counseling or some therapy sessions through online portal, FaceTime or something else would be critical. The impact of coronavirus has actually sped that up because policymakers finally moved on to an extent on the fact that we need to be able to provide people suffering with underlying conditions, chronic conditions, and mental health conditions without having to go into an office. So that actually has been a bump in the right direction. We've done a bunch of stuff on our Facebook page on this stuff too. So we had an entire broadcast, as we've been doing these every Monday and Thursday, exploring ways in which this virus is affecting society. We did one last Thursday, a week ago Thursday, with the cast of Being Evan Hansen, the Broadway show about social isolation, anxiety, depression, suicide. So we had the composers and the two lead actors come on, talk about their own issues with it, and how the show wrestles with it, and some of the resources that are available now. We've had a conversation with Trini Kusenek, a newscaster, a sportscaster from NBC 10, who has been very public about her issues with anxiety and depression, and came out publicly, and we've done a number of events with her over the course of the past couple of years, from a roundtable with professional athletes and Coach Brad Stevens and Troy Brown from the Patriots and Shamika Holsqua and a couple of others, talk about the impact for professional sports and professional athletes. And if it happens to them, it's going to happen to anybody. So let's lean into this problem and try to roll up our sleeves. And particularly given the social isolation that comes with the prevention measures, this is devastating on people that are already suffering with underlying mental behavioral health issues. And by the way, separate but sometimes related, domestic violence. And so we need to be all that more intentional about folks. If you know somebody that is suffering with some sort of mental behavioral health challenge, reach out, check in on them. Please do so on a consistent basis. We need to have that interaction. And just know that from a policy perspective, this is a big issue for me, and we're trying to make sure that we're providing additional resources. And again, we've got off our official Facebook or official website, right at the top, there's a COVID-19 resource guide. There's a whole section for mental behavioral health and additional places to go to get help or get access. And we'll keep pushing for reforms here to make sure that people get access to the help that they need, because people need it, absolutely.
So one last question, and then I'm going to do a little shout out to some of our friends who are on here. One person was asking Congressman if you had any specific thoughts around how we can jumpstart, if you will, our economy, which you know, is now part of the economic pandemic taking place across the globe, not just in the US.
So, yeah, a short question to end on, Colette. So I'll try to be succinct here. Look, I think on a broad level here, this is an economic crisis that is following a healthcare crisis and public health crisis, because we didn't have the adequate protections put in place, and the United States fell so far behind this because of a failure of testing and early detection and early intervention. And so by the time essentially the federal government motivated, we were way behind the 8 ball. So what needs to happen? We need to buy the time to get our public health infrastructure up and running in front of this. And look, the initial data that comes back from drugs like remdesivir is promising. And I think there's reasons to believe it could be even more promising. There's other drugs that are out there under clinical trials. All of these will be really helpful. And all of those innovations, literally week by week, we get stronger with this, and that's great. Heartened that at least so far on the data that we haven't seen these explosions through parts of the South the way we would have expected. In places in Miami, we saw a big outbreak in New Orleans, but it doesn't seem to have spread to other parts as badly as I think were initially feared. That leads some to believe that there might be some seasonality here, that it doesn't survive the heat as well as it might be feared. That's obviously good news with the upcoming summer months. But week by week, we learn more about it. Our opportunities to as we learn more about it to engage preventive measures and hopefully preventive medicine will increase as well. What needs to happen as we get in front of it, I think a phased restart here is the appropriate way to go about it. It's to follow the science and understand that as much as we wish or hope we were going to open up quickly, that I do think we have to follow the science on this. Obviously, there's going to be some risk. We cannot go to a place where we say we're only going to open up when we have a assurance that no one's going to get sick. That's well over a year from now, and no one can tolerate that. But I think we can say, how do we ensure that we mitigate the risks that we take? How do we ensure that people can start to feel confident about going back outside and engaging with society? Because until they do, our economy is still going to struggle. People aren't going to go out there and it's going to be a while, I think, before people feel like they can go to engage with 65,000 of their friends at Gillette Stadium, right? Or 37,000 friends at Fenway Park. You might be able to go out to dinner with at a restaurant that has adequate floor space, with waiters that are dressed in PPE. And, as we see things open up and people have confidence that people aren't getting sick, we can ease our way into this. But a major underlying part to our economy is just confidence that I'm going to get paid, confidence that I'm going to pay my bills, confidence that I'm going to go out there and not contract a deadly virus. And then confidence that if I do get sick, that we've got the people, the personnel, the equipment necessary to get me healthy again. And I think we're obviously not there on all of that yet, but I think we're starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel for at least some initial part to this. Till we get life back to quote unquote normal is a long time, unfortunately.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. And I want to give a shout out to Naomi Ashley, who is on here, and Barry Bluestone and Antoine Millay and Gary Bailey and Farida Kathwalia, who are all on here, along with so many others. So thank you all for joining us. This was a very engaging and never a dull moment when you have Congressman Kennedy in the House. And I am so sorry that we have a little technical difficulties. We don't know if it's on our side of the house or on the other side, but somehow we weren't able to see your shining face. But we want to thank you for all that you do for our state and for our country. And we are so lucky and blessed to have someone like you advocating on behalf of us. And, you know, we're here to support you, to help you, and to ensure that you become, I know I'm going to be partisan, that you become our next senator. So we thank you for that.
Colette, I am honored and grateful. I would have, I'm not so sorry that the camera's not working given 6 weeks of sheltering in place, but regardless, you always somehow seem to look marvelous and still do. But look, I obviously would, I'm grateful for the opportunity, everybody, and thanks for bearing with us through the technical issues and for having me. Would love to engage with everybody. If you've still got questions that we couldn't get to, please let me know. Colette can get them to me. We can follow up. And obviously would love to have your help on the campaign as we go forward. We got 4 months to go. And then I think a big fight, obviously, after that, should we be successful with the challenges we need to actually put in place the change that this country and I think our community here needs direly. So we'd love to have your help and support. Happy to engage with that at the appropriate time. But Colette, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Get Connected team for your hard work in putting this together, and to Nick Clemens and Jaquetta from the Kennedy team. Thank Team Kennedy. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Thank you, Colette.
Thank you. Okay.